Weight loss. It needs to be fast and sustainable. Noom GLP-1 starts at just $149 and ships to your door in 7 days. Take it from Lauren, who lost 22 pounds on Noom.
If I come off of the GLP-1, it's not going to automatically make my weight yo-yo back.
$149 GLP-1s? Now that's Noom smart. Get started at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. Individual results may vary. Not all customers will medically qualify for prescription medications. Compounded medications are not reviewed by the FDA for safety, efficacy, or quality.
If you're running a retail business, don't let disorganized order fulfillment cause chaos. Use ShipStation instead. From running a business out of your garage to multiple warehouses, ShipStation is ideal for every phase of your growth. Save time with one login for all your stores and by automating tasks. Plus, you'll get the best shipping rates from global carriers. Calm the chaos with the shipping software that delivers. Start a free trial at shipstation.com/audio. That's shipstation.com/audio.
Disappearances can happen to anyone at any time. Like I stated before, we all fall into our own disappearance demographic. The way you've lived your life, Jason, the way I've lived mine, other people, the way they've lived theirs, anybody listening to this, we all fall into certain demographics. Now, certain demographics are, you're less likely for it to happen. But we're all in one of them, and it's very possible that our number gets called one of these days. And it's one of those things that nobody ever thinks it's going to happen to them. And I've had more than one guest say, I can't believe I'm doing this. I can remember reading stories about other people going missing, never thought it would happen in my family, and then it does. And too often, for me, I got involved. I don't have anybody missing in my family. Nobody's been murdered in my family. But too many people take an interest or get involved only when it happens to them. It's kind of like, I've used the example of like cancer. Person, a woman doesn't contribute, doesn't give, every year to a 501c3 regarding breast cancer or anything else. But as soon as she gets it, man, she's going to every walk. She's wearing pink. She's wearing the ribbons and everything else because suddenly it affects her. We need everybody, whether they have disappearances in their family or not, to care about disappearances and to have compassion for these families and try to help them.
That's Ed Dentzel, the host of the Unfound podcast, a podcast that focuses exclusively on cases of missing persons. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. This is the second part of my interview with Ed Dentzel, the host of the Unfound podcast. In part one, Ed and I discussed his being adopted as a young child and growing up in a rural area outside of Pittsburgh before heading off to Las Vegas to become an actor and then eventually to Florida, where he fell into podcasting and finally combined it with his lifelong interests in mysteries, in particular, disappearances. Ed and I talked about how he began to focus on researching and reporting on missing persons cases, how the key to understanding a disappearance is to get to know the victim, and how, despite some misconceptions, relationships are the primary reason why people go missing. More than 450 episodes in, Ed has covered an enormous amount of long-term disappearances in a world where many law enforcement officers may never encounter one in their entire career. This missing wealth of knowledge, in many ways, is what Ed sees as a key obstacle to law enforcement effectively taking the steps early on that increase the likelihood of solving these cases. Today, we're going to discuss that, some of the other reasons for disappearances, the curious profiles of the men responsible for many of the disappearances of their intimate partners, and the importance of being able to take yourself out of your own shoes, put yourself into those of others, and have empathy for people experiencing a sense of ambiguous loss that's hard to imagine. We'll also discuss Ed's strange role as a witness in the trial of a man named Steve Pankey, who was convicted of the 1984 disappearance and murder of Jonelle Matthews, a 12-year-old Greeley, Colorado girl who went missing one night, was one of the first children to have their name and face placed on a milk carton, whose case was raised at a news conference the next year by President Ronald Reagan, and who, decades later, was found dead by workers who were installing a pipeline 15 miles from where she once lived. So relationships are the number one reason. What other factors do you see? Commonalities?
Well, drugs, addiction, mental health, people who bipolar, schizophrenic, maybe they've been managing it well for a very long time, and then they decide, I don't need this medication anymore. When it comes to addicts, it's amazing how many disappearances that we've featured where the people go missing either right after rehab or right before rehab.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's true.
What's your thought there?
Well, the reason they go missing before they go to rehab is because they don't want to go to rehab.
Right.
And it's one of those things, they want to continue to get high, so they run off, they disappear. And my guess is during that time, they then overdose almost to spite the people who want them to go to rehab. And then, of course, when people getting out of rehab, we all know that rehab rarely takes.
Right.
People go back and forth, back, keep trying to go. And, it works out for some people like Robert Downey Jr. And then for many, many others, it doesn't work out. And so what do? The first thing they do after they get out of rehab is go get high.
Yep.
And while they've been in rehab, maybe their tolerance has dropped, and boom, that's that.
Yep. Because essentially, and whether their tolerance has dropped or not, for a lot of addicts, you're chasing that same amount of high, and you haven't used in a while, so chances are you're going to make a party of it. I know in my mental health work, I've seen that a number of times where people come out of rehab and they overdose, sometimes, unfortunately, fatally. What about other factors in victimology? Do things like, the support system the person has, or their education, or other factors play a role?
Well, when it comes to, families and everything, it's certainly a factor of, are these people isolated? How much contact are they having with the people who truly love them? A lot of women, like I said, going back to the man said type of disappearance, these are women who usually have been blocked from seeing their family. Because once again, the guy's a control freak and he doesn't like her, family. And, there's that isolation that comes up once in a while. Those are some of the things.
What do you think, and I wonder whether this bleeds into your own life. What kinds of things would you tell somebody to look for if they were worried that someone might disappear, or worried about it potentially happening to them? And I know this might be an unreasonable question.
This is tough, because you have to understand something when it comes to me saying relationships are the number one cause of disappearances. What's really amazing about that is that these men, these suspects, most of them do not have criminal records. They don't have any criminal records before. Nope.
Wow.
They don't earn criminal records after the disappearances either. So it's just not as simple as saying, well, that guy's a bad guy. He's drinking and driving. He knocked over the local 7-Eleven, things like that. He's a drug dealer. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. And in fact, I think this is why I believe when it comes to that particular type of disappearance that we're kind of concentrating on in our talk tonight, although there are different kinds, there's the art of luring and drugs play a role. And then of a league of our own, these are all classifications, by the way, that I've created.
Mm-hmm.
With the man said type of disappearance, this is why I said for a lot of those types, I think these are crimes of passion. These are not things that are thought out. These are not things that are planned. These are spur of the moment, violent acts that happen. And maybe the relationship was abusive and nobody knew it. And then that particular time it went that one step further.
So it's not necessarily something that you, how do I put this? This is like a sad thing to say, that you might see in a lot of relationships. A lot of behaviors that you might see in other relationships, but they just end up going too far. You mentioned those other classifications, the art of luring you had mentioned. What are some of, I imagine ex-boyfriends are equally a dangerous pool. What are some of the other classifications you see?
Some of the other classifications that I've created, besides the man said.
Yep.
Is that what?
Yep.
Yeah. Like the art of luring. What I mean by that is people who were enticed to go do things that they normally wouldn't do. Maybe usually by people that they know, but sometimes by people they don't know. Good example of that would be the disappearance, the murder of Tyler North. It was finally proven to be a murder, and these people went to jail. But it's kind of real, you could. This is
what happened in that case. I'm not familiar. Yeah,
I'm going to tell you. Tyler North was divorced from his wife, but nobody knew that the two were still getting together to have sex. And so they would meet at this park at night. So he'd be over at his somewhere and he'd say he was going home, but really wasn't going home. He was going to meet his ex-wife to have sex. Then he would go home. And so the night that he was murdered, and this is beyond dispute now, this is accepted. He was at his sister's, and the whole time he's there, he's texting with his ex-wife and nobody knows it. And it's just like any other night that they're going to go have sex in this park. Well, that particular time when he showed up, the ex had her new boyfriend with her. And they killed Tyler. So she lured him to that park. Now, granted, they've been doing that over and over. They lured him to that park with the promise of sex and killed him. Another good example is Jeff Nichols out of Salt Lake City. He another ex-wife story. So we have, women can get in on this too. He was divorced from his wife and he was trying to get custody of their son and probably was going to successfully do so because his wife had gotten in trouble with the law. One day she called Jeff up and said, "Hey, I came across this free set of golf clubs. Would you like them?" And Jeff was a big golfer. He goes to meet her for the golf clubs. He was never seen again. His truck was eventually found. He was never seen again. The son, her parents all took off and fled to Ireland.
Oh, wow.
And so when the story goes is that she says, "Well, I called him to come pick these golf clubs up. He never showed up." That's the art of luring.
To pull them. Would you also fit within that bucket? And I can't remember what it was. It was a documentary or some TV show that I saw recently, and it was about these girls. There was this guy, I think it was in Florida, but this guy was basically luring them into sort of like boyfriend-girlfriend relationships, bringing them to one house, having them do prostitution and, like that, and, cam girl type stuff. And, he basically for practical purposes for their families, they were for the most part missing. Like the families may have known that they had gone to a different story or city, but eventually they ended up out of touch with them. Do you think there are a lot of cases, and do they fit in that category, or is that a different category?
I don't know the way you explained it there. I don't know how common that is. I would have to know the names. I'd have to know a little bit more about the details and everything to really say.
Yeah, because I wonder whether like cases like that, probably like human trafficking stuff in general, they get a lot of attention, right? Particularly if it's a missing white girl. But they get a lot of attention, or a disproportionate amount of attention, but they aren't as common as the kinds of things that really do happen.
I will tell you, I know that once again, there are a lot of ideas that I have about disappearances that are contrary to what is generally accepted.
What are some of those?
I will tell you that 355 disappearances, I think I've only covered it. And once again, I think it's a random sample because, like I said before, the people choose to come on to the podcast. I'm not picking out particular disappearances that I want to cover because of whatever reason. It's just what you might call a shotgun approach. We're just, reaching out to many people and let's see who responds. So it's a random sample. Unfound's disappearances catalog of disappearances is a random sample. Just like we just had a presidential election. If you would have randomly sampled 355 people in the United States, that's how polling's done. So I have 355 disappearances for the podcast. That is a random sample of the disappearances, mostly in the United States. So, because of that, and I lost my train of thought here, unfortunately.
We were talking about how common certain kinds of things are.
Right.
Yeah.
And what I was going to say, yes, is that I've only covered maybe 2 that were sex trafficking out of 355.
Wow.
That's it.
Wow.
Sex trafficking is a thing, but the facts just don't play out the way the advocates say.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they'll have you believe that every young woman who goes missing is being sex trafficked and everything. And, yes, do women get sex trafficked from other countries to the United States?
Yes. We know that. Yeah.
Yes. But when was the last time you heard of an American woman being sex trafficked to another country? I'm not saying it's never happened, but we have a country of 330 some million people. I can't name one off the top of my head, so it can't be that common. Now, within the United States, could happen, but you have to start really deciding what is the meaning of sex trafficking. A lot of advocates who overdo the numbers because that gets attention. They'll put any prostitution in the category of sex trafficking. Well, not all prostitution is sex trafficking.
Right. Like, and I also think to some extent where we probably see a lot of it, or that I've read a lot of it in the United States, is sort of like what you would say, you're going back to your point about relationships being dangerous in some ways. You're in a relationship with someone and it becomes the side hustle. It becomes the way to make money. And sometimes there's an element of coercion in that, if that makes sense.
Right. So with sex trafficking, it's just not as big a factor in the overall disappearance picture as people think it is.
So like that, the idea of, you can't think of a case, and I don't know, I can't think of a case where someone just sort of vanishes without a trace, and then all of a sudden we find out they're being sex trafficked.
Now we have, who was it? Ariel Castro, who had those women.
Yes. In Cleveland. Right.
That happened. And I had a disappearance that I featured of Jesse Foster, who got sex trafficked from Canada. That's one of the ones I mean, to Las Vegas. But it happens. But it's just not the most common type of disappearance when it comes to women. It's just not.
On the flip side of it, we were talking about some of the common ones, like the husband example or the luring example. What are some of the ones that you've covered that have just been way out there or not within the normal patterns?
Yeah, so that would be what we call a league of their own. And that would be like Dale Kerstetter, who was a security guard at a glass plant in Pennsylvania back in the 1980s. And while he was working the night shift, a thief showed up and took him hostage. The thief went into one of the kilns there. When you make glass, all of those kilns are lined with platinum. The thief went in there and cut out a piece of the platinum out of one of these kilns. And there is actually security video of the thief holding Dale hostage.
Oh, wow.
And then when everybody came to work the next day, of course, Dale's truck is there. He's not. And they noticed that this burglary took place, and Dale has never been seen since. And that was like almost 40 years ago.
Wow. What are the theories in that case?
I'll tell you my theory.
Go for it.
I think that Dale was in on this, and I think he got double crossed. I think that it was a plan where, I'm the guard. You come in here, take that. I'll pretend I'm your hostage. You take me away. They'll find me you drop me off somewhere, and then we'll split the proceeds once you sell the platinum. Because as I ended up finding out later, there was a lot of platinum being stolen in the United States in the 1970s and 80s. It was there was actually, it was a thing. And I think that Dale got double crossed is what I think. I think he thought that other guy would sell it. They could split it or whatever. And then the other guy decided, I'm just going to keep this all for myself.
Yeah.
Because Dale was not the kind of guy who was going to run off and start a new life somewhere.
Yeah.
And of course his body's never been, it's just hard for me to imagine him being taken away and herded into some vehicle and him all doing this, doing this willingly or being forced to do it. I mean, that's a lot of logistics.
Right.
The thief why not just shoot Dale right there? Why make him disappear unless there was some sort of other thing going on?
Do you think like one of the dangers of sort of like, we talked about how sometimes the law enforcement doesn't react properly, but then a number of these cases do eventually bubble up to become a part of the broader conversation. But do you think there's a danger in us, in true crime enthusiasts and others who are following or advocating for cases of focusing on the possibilities instead of the probabilities?
Yeah, that's why I went back before and said, you have to know it when you see it. When you hear when you hear about the person, then you hear about the circumstances, you have to be able to narrow down what happened very, very quickly. Because the fact is that in a lot of these disappearances, it's not obvious that a crime was committed. And so when you start listening to it, you should have a Rolodex in your head of other disappearances, mostly the solved ones. The solved disappearances are just as important as the unsolved. This is the scientific method. That when a police officer detective should show up, and when the mother's talking about her missing daughter, he should, or she, the detective, should be able to say, you know what? I know about that disappearance from a few years ago that got solved that sounds a lot like this, and this is how it got solved. They should be able to do that. They can't. Is there
a repository? Because I know, for example, crime analysts who work at the FBI, they will collect this kind of data. They build statistical information for the behavioral analysis unit and other things like this. But that's the only space where I've heard people talk about things like, statistically, if X and Y happen, it's likely to be Z. I don't hear that on a local law enforcement level. Is there some kind of resource on solved cases that people can lean on, or law enforcement can lean on?
No. Well, if you take an interest, I have that repository in my mind because I take an interest in this.
Have you started to catalog it?
I have.
Okay,
I have it's funny you mentioned that. I have somebody doing that right now, going through, starting at the beginning and going through and putting the facts with each case. And there's like 60 different parameters for each disappearance.
Oh yeah, that'll be fascinating to see when, once you pull it together.
It's going to be a while.
That's it.
It's going to be a while, but you have to have that if you want, because once again, the circumstances and the person are not necessarily going to tell you anything because there's no evidence. This is why disappearances are so much more difficult than murders. Murders, you have a body, you have a crime scene, you usually know what the weapon was, you're going to have forensics and things. In disappearances, you have none of that. So you have to rely on the work that other people have done.
Have you ever had moments where, I know we'll talk about this in probably a second about the Jonelle Matthews case, but have you ever had times where you've been able to help law enforcement with cases or engage them on a deeper level with some of the insight that you have? Are they even open to it?
After a few disappearances, I've had law enforcement contact me and maybe ask me for not transcript, but a recording of the episode. That's happened a couple times. When the Mary Jane Van Gilder disappearance was solved earlier this year, I was thanked at the press conference in Ohio.
What's the backstory behind that case?
Mary Jane Van Gilder was a married woman from West Virginia, but she was over in Ohio working during World War II. She was working in a factory to support the war effort in World War II. And World War II was winding down. That factory was going to be shut down, wasn't needed anymore. But she quit that job before that happened. And she never went back to West Virginia. She was never seen again. And Adam Turner, a police officer there, decided to take this on, trying to figure out what happened. And he discovered, of course, the science finally caught up with Mary Jane Van Gilder. And the science figured out that, and this is something that I did expect, once again, just looking at everything, that she ran off with another guy and seemingly got married, although they haven't been able to find the marriage certificate. She ran off with her supervisor at that factory. She moved to Arkansas. She had more kids. She died of cancer in 1989.
Oh, wow.
44 years after she went missing.
Did she change her name or?
She even kept her first name.
Oh, interesting. And the manager disappeared at the same time or?
Nope.
Oh, interesting.
He was from the area. She just went home with him.
Wow.
And nobody thought to even talk to him back in 1945.
Wow.
Didn't even, had that been, they'd been smart enough, somebody said, well, you know what? And the funny thing is, on the very paperwork in which she was quitting the company, his name is on the sheet as her supervisor. His name was right there.
Oh, wow. Do you think that did people in her life when she moved, did they know the story of her disappearing? Or do you think because not being able to find the marriage certificate makes me wonder whether they did that on purpose, did not.
Right. Well, I don't know if they ever got married, technically married. They just told people they were married and maybe they couldn't get married because then that would have meant that she would need an ID or something. And even in 1940 something terms, who knows where that might go. But on top of that, Mary Jane, when she was diagnosed with cancer, she told one of her grandkids, I have a secret and I hope nobody ever finds out about it.
Oh, wow. Wow. Well, that's telling.
Yeah. So Adam had come on to the podcast. We I gave it publicity. I gave him some of my opinions on what I thought happened. And I don't know if I knew that could have absolutely predicted she got married again and had kids, but I never believed that she died.
What was it that tipped you off?
It just seemed, something that wasn't mentioned. In the paperwork for her quitting, she said the reason that she was quitting the job was because she had additional household duties.
Huh. That's a curious
That was
phrase.
a lie, because she didn't have any additional household duties, because she was supposed to be going back to West Virginia, which she didn't do. Well, that implies that maybe she was in a relationship with somebody else and she was expected to do more at home. And so I start thinking, what are the odds that she goes missing right as the war efforts winding down? And it just didn't seem that likely to me. It just, and on top of the fact, maybe I should have, her husband wasn't known as being the nicest guy around. I also have to think, what kind of woman, once again, in 1945 terms, leaves her family and goes to Ohio by herself to work.
Right.
When she really doesn't have to do that. And in fact, recently I've just come out and voiced the idea, I think she had that planned all along.
That may have been from the beginning, the whole point of going to the factory, because the wartime factories that, women were participating in that time. Why would you go all the way out there for it? That's fascinating. That's actually a really interesting point. And so what was the reason why they thanked you? Was there something that you had noticed, or the awareness?
Yeah, because I publicized it. I think that I gave some good input, from my experience with Adam. I think that's why I did it.
So, one of the things that I think is probably one of the most, interesting or odd or unique things about, I think, your experience of podcasts. Not a lot of true crime podcasters actually make it into court and have to take the stand and testify. And that comes out of your coverage of it's 1984, right? 1984 disappearance of Jonelle Matthews, Greeley, Colorado. What was your involvement in that case? Like, I know it comes from your interview with the man who was eventually convicted of it, Steve Pinky, but how did that even come about?
He contacted me. I probably had heard about Jonelle's disappearance at one point in my life, especially since President Reagan mentioned it. I probably had read about it before, but I would not say that it was on my mind in 2019. And just out of nowhere, this guy, Steve, contacted me. First, he was a Patreon supporter. And then one day he revealed who his full name and said, I'm a suspect. And that girl that was found, remains were found in Colorado? Yeah. Yep. I'm a suspect in her murder.
So he was basically a true crime fan who was listening to your podcast.
Somehow knew about, I don't know if he, I don't know. I don't know how many episodes he's listened to or not. I've never asked him.
That's interesting.
So somehow I knew about it though. So he reached out to me. That's how it happened. And I ended up interviewing him in October of 2019.
Wow. Yeah. And that's not something you normally do. Interview potential suspects.
No, it's the only one. Only one ever. And that ends up being the most famous interview. Funny how that works.
Just given the focus of your podcast, and so much of it is, victims' loved ones coming on to talk to you. Was it a difficult decision to let somebody who is suspected on?
I wouldn't say it was a difficult decision. I would just say it wasn't a quick one.
Okay.
I talked to my people, volunteers, assistants about it. And eventually I came to the belief that really, in my most general form, I am a reporter. Podcasting is just a medium. I am a reporter. And so I have the responsibility to get the word out and interview this person honestly as best to my ability. And so that's what drove my decision making.
How long did you guys sit down to interview? What was that like?
It was like 3.5 hours.
Wow.
Of course, I've never met him in person. This was all done over the phone. In fact, the interview that I did with Steve was the only time I ever did talk to him on the phone, although we had many email exchanges. 3.5 hours. Some of it got edited out at the trial because some things were thought to be prejudicial.
Yeah, more prejudicial than probative.
So it was. So I don't know how many minutes shorter the trial version was, to be honest with you, but that's how it happened. It recorded, and then DA Michael Rourke out there found out about it. They charged Steve in 2020. There's a trial in 2021, a hung jury. Trial in 2022, find him guilty, and he's been in jail ever since. And Steve and I write letters back.
What did they want from your interview? Because before you dive into that, let me just say one thing about
the main point was to show how certain stories Steve told changed over the years. What he told me was different what he told somebody else at some other time, and something that he told the police back in 1980 something or whatever. That he has these shifting stories and he shouldn't be trusted.
So one interesting thing I found about this case, and I still, for the life of me, I've dug into the trial transcript, I've read the stories about it, I've seen lots of things on it. I think there was a documentary on it, and I can't.
In the one.
I cannot, for the life of me, figure out why he was convicted.
I agree with you.
It was a little weird. I was
the only person on the Oxygen Network show that made that point. Everybody else thinks Steve was guilty.
He just seems like a really obsessed true crime fan who probably kind of as so many people do, and I've seen it on so many cases, kind of insinuate yourself, become very obsessed. I mean, they're just really extreme version of all of us who are true crime fans. And then, and maybe it's my work in mental health, having dealt with people who have a little neurodiversity, become very obsessed, and sort of have a restricted set of interests. It's really easy for them to get over involved and sometimes say crazy things that you because just thinking to myself, if you were law enforcement and you knew a lot of the things you knew about Steve's personality or some of the quirky, weird things he's done, a confession without evidence is just a story. So I just found it very, very, very interesting that he was convicted.
Yeah, I hear about a lot of Steve Pankies. Some of these disappearances that we've already mentioned, Jennifer Kessie, Mara Murray, Brianna Maitland, they all have Steve Pankey-like characters who follow them, obsess on them, go on Reddit at 3 a.m, go on Web Sleuths, all sorts of Steve Pankey-like characters out there.
Yeah. It's just strange for one of them to be convicted too, because they feel so common.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. As far as
a lesson to all of us.
I've become to the idea that he was convicted because the second trial they were allowed to let in the woman that he allegedly raped in 1977. I think that the jury decided that he got away with that rape in 1977, so decided to convict him for that.
Sort of what they call a public service conviction. You're not really necessarily guilty of what's in front of us, or maybe you are, maybe you aren't, but
right.
You're a bad person. Right. Yeah, it's unfortunate. Do you still have any communication with him?
Yeah, just got a letter from him last week.
Oh, what?
I've been writing to him for over a year now.
Oh, wow. What do you, without divulging confidence, what kinds of things do you guys talk about?
I ask, most recently, the last few letters have been about things that came out of the Oxygen Network show that I didn't know, and things that caught my attention, and I needed to ask Steve about them. They're topics that he and I never discussed. And so I sent him a bunch of questions, and he eventually answered all of the questions.
So you plan to continue covering the case?
Do I plan?
Yeah.
I'm working on, we got some things going on behind the scenes that I can't really talk about.
Oh, neat. Well, wow. At least it's, I mean, I think it's worth it probably to follow things through. I think that's an important part of being a reporter, not to just leave it on the table. So glad to hear you continue to go through that. You know, one of the things that I had heard you say in another interview that there were more than 30 cases that you've covered that have come to some kind of resolution. And so 300, you know, north of 350 cases you've done.
Yep.
31 have come to resolution.
Less than 10%.
Wow.
Yeah.
What kinds of you know, just sort of stepping back and thinking about that, to me, and maybe it's my own naivety, but that feels shockingly small. But I'm also curious, like how do these kinds of things come to resolution? What are some of the things you've learned about the ones that have come to resolution?
Too much luck is getting these cases solved.
Oh, yeah.
Too much luck, not enough step-by-step process of coming to the conclusion. Too much luck. And what do I mean by luck? As an example, Esther Westenbarger, who went missing in Kokomo, Indiana, I think 2009. She went out to a bar in Kokomo with some friends, and her brother was there as well. There's video of her getting in her car and leaving the bar. She was never seen again, even though she lived less than 2 miles away from the bar. She and her car went missing. And there were searches for her all over the place, not found. I will even, being that I covered that disappearance early on in my disappearance career, I will tell you that I thought that she was murdered. I thought she got carjacked or something. These days, I would never think that. And I would get this one right. But because once again, this is what we're here to do. We're here to learn. And so it was a mystery. Her daughter was on the podcast, I think in 2017. And then what was it? 2019, I think. There is not far from where she lived, there was like a housing plan. And right on the border, right near the road of this housing plan was a retention pond. You already know where I'm going with this. And the retention pond always had a lot of, algae and muck on the top of it. Had always been since it was there. And the HOA there decided that just didn't look very good. So they decided we're going to put some chemicals in that to clear that all up. They put chemicals in it. All the algae vanished. Some kids went out in a little boat to do some fishing or something one day. They looked down in the retention pond, and there was Esther's car.
Oh, wow.
She was in it. So why didn't they do that? Well, it seems that she took the wrong road home. So to imagine she lived on a road that went north and south. She was on a north and south road, 1 block west of the road that she should have been on. And she was, I think, just tooling along. And unfortunately, this retention pond was at the T side, the cross of a T side of an intersection. So it's a 3-way intersection.
Oh.
She was coming up to the T where she was going to have to stop, make a left or right. She blew the stop sign, flew off into the
retention pond. Yeah.
And they did show that it was her. The car was in drive and the ignition was in the on position.
Oh, wow.
So that's what I mean by luck. The HOA doesn't decide to do that. Now you may be asking, should not have that pond been searched?
That is the question I was going to ask.
Yes. Why do you think it wasn't? Because like me being a newbie, people just decided she was murdered. Whereas we now know, once again, 355 episodes later, when people go missing with their cars, most of the time they are found with their cars. And so these days, if Esther hadn't been found and her daughter would have appeared on Unfound, I'd be thinking, you need to go look at some of the local waterways. Now, what made it tough is that this retention pond was was not been on the regular way home. She, like I said, Esther made a mistake, maybe because she was drinking and driving. She was a little sloshed when she left and you have to remember, she also had just moved to Kokomo, so she might not have known the roads. But I think in retrospect, looking at everything, I would have said, you know what? I think that retention pond needs to be searched.
And it's, probably a great point about how knowledge builds upon knowledge, going back to what you were saying before about there needs to be some kind of repository and systems and processes built around this. Are there any examples out of that 31 where you feel like law enforcement did a good job to solve them?
Well, I mean, we've already mentioned Mary Jane Van Gilder. Once again, like I stated, it just took some time for the science to catch up with Mary Jane. There's no way when she went missing in 1945 that she could have ever guessed that something called DNA was going to get her caught. In fact, when she died in 1989, there's no way maybe she could have guessed that DNA was ever going to, solve her disappearance, because at that point, DNA for me doesn't start becoming a real thing in disappearances or murders and all that till about the mid 90s. But still, it was already kind of getting started. Police were already collecting DNA, believing that one day science would be able to use it. So that was great police work by Adam Turner. Used the tools that became available. Tools that police in the 60s, 70s, 80s did not have. Of course, we have to have 23andMe and Ancestry.com and the Othram Labs. It takes a village. So, so that was all great work, and it just took a lot of time. Another one, unfortunately, I don't have the list in front of me. I think probably what's, noteworthy about that 31, 32 disappearances is how different they all are. They aren't all murders. They're not all suicides. They aren't all accidents. They aren't all overdoses. They're a little mixture of everything. And that's what's interesting to me. That we have some murders that got solved. We have people running off and starting new lives that got solved. Suicide. Devin Bond, very sadly, in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, a young man committed suicide. We have some people who overdosed, stumbled away from their cars, and eventually their bones were found in the bushes. A little bit of everything.
I'm curious about one thing, thinking about just sort of other creators who covered these cases. I'm curious about what kind of advice you have for them. There are a number of, like the original More Murray podcast you saw, or like one of the things that comes to mind is Payne Lindsay's Up and Vanished and his exploration of like Ashley Loring Heavy Runner. And, there are a number of, prominent podcasts that do disappearances, and, many of them probably do them well. Some of them don't do them so well. And I'm just curious what advice you would give if you were sitting down with a creator. And I'm thinking about it from the perspective, and I know you're not an advocate, you're a journalist. I think you have unique insight into what leads to disappearances, but you also have probably insight into the grief, the emptiness, the pain that family members experience, and what could cause sort of like unnecessary harm for them. I'm just wondering what advice you would give people.
Creators, people are going to start their own podcasts regarding disappearances or something. And by that way, that's something that
or already have their own podcast.
They already have their own. Well, if they already have their own podcast, they're probably already etched in stone how they want to do it. All I can say is my attitude with doing Unfound and covering disappearances is that I've always said there's only one way to do it, and that's the right way. And that is not being sensational, sticking to the facts. We don't talk about theories. We're not out to defame anybody. I'm going to let the guest say what he or she wants to say, but we're going to do it in a structured manner and make sure everybody understands what everything that's being said. That's the way I see it. The way I do things is not for everybody because I put interview outlines together. Whereas a lot of people, they just talk to the people and then all edit it together. One way is easier at the end. The other one's easier at the beginning. You just can't treat it as if with this topic of disappearances, you can't treat it like it's video games. We're not doing podcasts about video games. We're not doing podcasts about, paparazzi. We're not doing podcasts. We're not covering, it's not a cooking show. Because of that, I think that there has to be a certain tone to it. And
what kind of tone do you mean?
I think a very modest tone. A tone in which you're, deferential, to the topic. You're deferential to the families. You're deferential to the missing person. You bring a kind of self-awareness to the topic, and realizing there's only a certain way to act regarding this. And this, like I said very, very early in this conversation, this is real. This is why, with the interviews that I do, we don't even start talking about the day of the disappearance, maybe 45 minutes, an hour into the interview. We spend a lot of time getting to know the missing person because to stress, this is real. This is what's going on. And if you treat it just too much like it's an episode of Columbo, I think you're missing the point.
Well, I mean, going back to your point about victimology, you need to know the victim, but more, I think I've found, more importantly, at least from my interviews, is that we spend so much time talking about the moment where something went wrong that we don't often capture the person, and we're not capturing then what was lost. And that really takes something away from the stories in my mind.
Yep. Yeah. For
you, what do you hope comes out of both your podcast, and what do you hope sort of like comes in terms of resolution?
Solve a lot of these disappearances and make sure that when people come away from the episodes, they know exactly what happened. They realize that these are real people. And also we're creating this catalog that maybe eventually people can use to help learn about disappearances themselves using all of these disappearances that have been featured on Unfound.
So if I gave you a job tomorrow at the Department of Justice, and I put you in charge of missing persons cases, I also changed the grooming rules so you could have long hair. What would you do?
First thing, you got to have a curriculum for disappearances. You got to sit all your agents down and teach them about disappearances. That's what you got to do. Everything kind of that we talked here, present examples. Why did these people go missing? What do these disappearances look like? What should you be thinking when you show up there? You should already be getting in your mind the questions that you want to ask given what you know already. That's because that's not done. There's no, you look at any criminal justice program in the United States, you'll have a lot about forensics and procedure and all that. Not one class on disappearances, period. Zero.
That's wild to think. It take up so much of the public.
You're right. Right. So this is why I told you along, in the first hour, families are too deferential to the police. They think the police know what they're doing. How are they supposed to know what they're doing? They have no education. And most police officers probably are going to work their entire careers and never come across a disappearance that lasts longer than a week. So how can you expect them to be knowledgeable about what to do? We learn one of two ways. Learning from what other people do and learning from what we do. And police don't have either.
Right. Without the knowledge, without the experience, then you end up in it kind of, I think one of the things in listening to you that has probably become much more clear for me is, and I know you've been critical of law enforcement, but I think I have a deeper understanding now of why, everything from your point about not enough focus being put on victimology, not you can't really everything about probability without some kind of repository of information is just really an intuitive experience-based guess. And if there's not a lot of experience, then
you can't make a guess.
Yeah.
You can't make an intuitive guess. You're right. With murders, a huge step in the process is already taken care of. We know there was a crime.
Right.
With disappearances, we know something out. But with disappearances, we don't know. We really, don't. We can, once again, we have to use statistics and what we know about disappearances to guide us, because maybe I should put it this way. If we just look at the facts of every disappearance, pretty much, maybe except for maybe Jody Hughes and Schrute, where stuff was left behind, but for the most part, most disappearances, if you look at the facts, there's nothing that should be investigated, because most of them doesn't look like a crime was committed. And police don't investigate incidents. They investigate crimes.
One of the things that I've noticed in my work is that there's something very different. I mean, to your point about there's something very different about murder cases and missing persons cases in terms of the evidence and the way that they're investigated. There's something very different, you probably know this from interviewing so many people. There's something very different about what the loved ones of the victims are going through. And I think it ties back to what you were just saying. It's one thing to know that someone has been murdered, and you don't know exactly what happened, and there's some, you're waiting for resolution, you want an arrest, there may be anger, but there's something very different about it just being a blank spot.
Yep. It's called ambiguous grief.
What is that?
Ambiguous grief is being sad, but you're not really sure what you're sad about. Because we have to remember, being that there was no crime, it doesn't look like a crime was committed. Very well could be that person's out there living under an assumed, like Mary Jane, pulling a Mary Jane Van Gilder. So are you supposed to be sad about that?
Right.
It's ambiguous grief. It's the not knowing what happened. Then I've had more than enough guests tell me, if it was murder, I'll let the killer go free. I don't care what he did, as long as we could just find our missing loved one. He doesn't have to go to jail. He could live out the rest of his life a free man. We don't care. A lot of guests have said that. The ambiguous grief, not knowing how to feel about something when you're not sure exactly what happened.
All right. It makes sense. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up, but I wanted to give you a shot, Ed, for just any closing thoughts about, because one of the things that really strikes me about talking to you is that despite how much space in a place like the true crime world, or even on documentaries or other spaces in the media, missing persons cases takes up, it sounds like we don't know a lot about them, and we try to fit them into a certain narrative and template of murder, or the neighborhood serial killer, or Israel Keys did it. And, just in sort of thinking about closing thoughts, if you could sort of change anything about the way people think about these cases more broadly, kind of like going back to our point about stranger danger. What would it be?
Disappearances can happen to anyone at any time. Like I stated before, we all fall into our own disappearance demographic. The way you've lived your life, Jason, the way I've lived mine, other people, the way they've lived theirs, anybody listening to this, we all fall into certain demographics. Now, certain demographics are, you're less likely for it to happen. But we're all in one of them, and it's very possible that our number gets called one of these days. And it's one of those things that nobody ever thinks it's going to happen to them. And I've had more than one guest say, I can't believe I'm doing this. I can remember reading stories about other people going missing, never thought it would happen in my family, and then it does. And too often, for me, I got involved. I don't have anybody missing in my family. Nobody's been murdered in my family. But too many people take an interest or get involved only when it happens to them. It's kind of like, I've used the example of like cancer. A woman doesn't contribute, doesn't give, every year to a 501c3 regarding breast cancer or anything else. But as soon as she gets it, man, she's going to every walk. She's wearing pink. She's wearing the ribbons and everything else because suddenly it affects her. We need everybody, whether they have disappearances in their family or not, to care about disappearances and to have compassion for these families and try to help.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think,
that's human nature. It's, what we're talking about here is human nature. We don't take an interest in things until it affects us.
And a lot of our ills, though, and, I am a firm believer that we as humans have more in common than we have as differences, right? We all suffer, for example. We all go through certain things, but I think a lot of our ills really relate to the idea of not being able to step out of our own shoes and our own experiences to see other people as humans. I think a lot of the interest in disappearances, people like mysteries, they like puzzles, they want to help. There are all sorts of reasons, but I think one of them is to convince myself of how that's not going to happen to me because that person was a drug addict or, it was
there's a lot of non-drug addicts going missing, and there's a lot of non-prostitutes going missing. And but on the other hand, there's a lot of non-husbands going missing. All sorts of different types of people going missing.
Well, Ed, thanks for what you're doing. I look forward to continuing to follow the podcast. And needless to say, I just started this year, so I am not. How many episodes are we at now? 460 something. I got a long way to go to finally catch up. But I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate your interest in this area and putting yourself outside of your own box. I was thinking as you were making the point that you haven't had somebody go missing. You sort of were the missing person, though. Your birth parents.
Well, they found me. I mean, we didn't follow that thread, but it's one of those things. I'm a naturally curious person, but I was not the one who found my bio family. They found.
Yeah. But even just thinking, and I was sort of thinking in my mind, like somebody, even though they gave you up, I'm sure they spent years and years and years wondering, what was happening to you and whether you were okay. You talked about that idea of ambiguous grief. I imagine with adoption, there's an element of that, even though what happened to the person, they're probably alive, but you don't know what's happening to them. Or you suspect they're alive. You don't really know. Anyway, well, thank you very much. And, looking forward to continue to follow you and looking forward to seeing the good work. And I appreciate it. I'm glad you're out there doing it, fighting against the headwinds.
Thanks.
If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, We can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all again in a few days.
Life can be chaotic. If you're running a retail business, don't let disorganized order fulfillment add to the chaos. Use ShipStation instead. With ShipStation, you never have to worry about shipping and fulfillment again. Whether you're running a business out of your garage or you have multiple warehouses, ShipStation is ideal for every phase of your business's growth. Save time with one login for all your stores and by automating repetitive tasks. Plus, you'll save money with the best shipping rates from global carriers. ShipStation's industry-leading features help you deliver a better customer experience. They'll get accurate and faster shipments along with automated tracking updates with your branding. And with up to 88% off UPS and USPS rates and up to 90% off FedEx rates, ShipStation is the fastest and most affordable way to ship. Calm the chaos. Switch to ShipStation today. Start a free trial at shipstation.com/audio. That's shipstation.com/audio.